Happy Easter. Yeah, well and truly awake now, that's for sure. Okay, if you have your Bibles there, just ask you to turn to Mark, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 16. Mark chapter 16, and we're just going to read from verses 1 to 8. Jesus is risen. When the Sabbath was over, Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb, and they asked each other, "Who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb?" But when they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in white robes sitting on their right-hand side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him. But go and tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him, just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Okay, so would you agree with me or stand with me in saying that we do live in a very strange world? Would you agree with me? We do indeed. And why do I say this? Because we believe, from what we've read in Mark's Gospel today, that a man 2,000 years ago came back to life from death. He wasn't just resuscitated to life, he wasn't in a coma for 3 days, but he was transformed to a new kind of life. And if you were here on Friday, you would have heard that this man of Nazareth, from Nazareth, named Jesus, in the Middle East around 2,000 years ago, was quite dead. He was placed in a tomb, and today we are told that he is alive again. And he's alive in a different kind of way. Later stories, if they are true, would suggest that he appeared and disappeared to people. He ate and spoke, and at times he was recognisable and at other times he wasn't. These stories that recall that he appeared to hundreds of people during a period of time that he was around. Now, if you're sitting there and thinking, yeah, well, you know, that kind of thing happens and that's what we celebrate and stuff, then I would suggest that maybe you need to get some therapy because this is not normal. Would you agree? And do you understand what I'm saying here? Also, the way that this story speaks and the way the text speaks to us today, it does come across as a historical event. It is laid out, and we should read it as things that happened in a time in history. It seems to describe these events that happen in a linear sort of fashion, like you would record a piece of history. The story goes that a man dies, and then after the obligatory observances, the day of rest, Sabbath, which was customary for the time, some of the women, as was custom, travelled to the tomb to the dead guy to put some spices and herbs on him. Now this, in this period, wasn't mummification, but rather an anointing to manage the smell as the body decayed. Not a pleasant job, but customary, and customary for the women to do this at the time. When the body had fully decayed, then and only the bones were left, then the women would go back. They would take the bones, they would put them in a box, and then put them in a crypt, either in the same tomb or in a separate tomb. So nothing too far out of the ordinary for this type of story. But is that what Mark is actually recalling here as this historical event? And is it actually history, and is it actually an event? Are these actually events that can be verified, or is this a fable or a story that has been created by clever ancient authors or not so ancient authors? A bit like a Tom Clancy novel, I guess. It becomes this exciting, action-packed story that enables the imagination to run wild. But in the end, it's just really a made-up story. Because as the story goes, and as we heard, things don't continue to be run-of-the-mill, do they? Can we actually verify any of what Mark is saying here about the resurrection of Jesus? Next slide, thanks. Now, Richard Bauckham is a highly regarded New Testament scholar from the University of Cambridge. And in his book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, he discusses the verifiability of the ancient witnesses and the importance of eyewitness testimony in this period of time. He would suggest that in ancient times, when the Gospels were written, the culture treated the testimony of eyewitnesses as significant to verify telling the truth. But it's not unlike today, is it really? Eyewitness accounts are generally key in any trial or pursuit to find out what really happened, what was the truth. He says that in the Gospels, Jesus' teaching was not only transmitted by anonymous masses, but also, and very significantly, by particular individuals. The traditions were originated and formulated by named witnesses in whose name they were transmitted and who remained living and active guarantors of the tradition. So do you hear what he's saying there? He's saying that living and accessible eyewitnesses are key to ensuring that the story is true and correct. Next slide. So then, how do we explain some of the variations in the account, though, you may well ask? There is clearly different accounts of the events on the day of the resurrection. For example, Matthew mentions Mary Magdalene and the other Mary, is all that he says there. Luke mentions that the women took spices. Later on in the chapter, that same chapter, it says that it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, who we find out in Luke chapter 8, was the wife of Chuza, the household steward of King Antipas. Mary, the mother of James and the others, who updated the apostles when they came back. John mentions only Mary Magdalene. And now Mark is saying it was Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James and Salome, who was the mother of James and John. So each of these Gospels has a different focus on the event, and each Gospel has Mary Magdalene mentioned, which is interesting. But other women are included in some of the retelling of the story. Now, is that okay? I think it is, because we even do this today. I don't know if you've noticed that. It's a bit like the story of when Tracy and I met. Tracy has one perspective and I have another. I tell the story of how we met similarly but different to how Tracy tells that story. I generally start a bit later. Tracy likes to start at the time when we first met, the very first time, when travelling in GT's car to a youth event. She was in the front seat with her friend Liz, and I was in the back seat with a couple of mates. I was only 15 at the time. It was a fleeting interaction, not very significant. She thought I was a dork. It's not worth pursuing. It's an irrelevant part of the story. The story for me starts when I met her at youth club. It was in this room, actually. There were the little heart flutters when I saw her little Ford Laser in the car park as I came in. And yeah, exactly. It was a fantastic car. And she was there sitting at the back here, at that door, actually. See that door there? This used to be the youth hall in those days. And that door was a little half door, and she was there. Anyway, so it goes. Well, you see it too also when you're at those events, you know, where the two of us, you're at a wedding or whatever, and people say, oh, so how did you meet? And it's a bit like a dance, really, you know. Each of us telling the story, each having our own little parts. Tracy correcting me on dates and times and those sorts of things. The details are not minute by minute. It is condensed. It is exciting for us, but the hearers don't want to go into all the gory details. But each of us has our own view of the events and how they passed. Does that mean that my story or view is not correct or true? Maybe Trace would think so, but I was there. So that's my point. Do you get my point here? What we see here is Mark being true to his view of what happened. He was there. It is true he is focusing on one aspect of the event. And he is being true to the historicity of the event as it occurred, and true to telling the story in the context of the literature that he was pulling together. Next slide, thanks. What is also clear is Mark is using these women in particular throughout the course of the events over the previous 3 days. All the women named, were at the death and the burial, as well as the resurrection. We see them named in Mark chapter 15. So Mark chapter 15, 40 to 41, it says, some women were watching from a distance. Among them were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and the younger, and of Joseph and Salome. In Galilee, these women had followed him and cared for his needs. Many of the women who had come up with him to Jerusalem were also there. So this is at the crucifixion where these women were. In 1547, it says, Mary Magdalene and Mary the mother of Joseph saw where he was laid. So this is an important detail that Mark is applying to telling his story here. There's no opportunity to find holes in the historicity of the event. If they were at the death and the resurrection but missed the burial, then how do we know that Jesus was actually buried? Or if the women were at the burial and the resurrection, how do we know that Jesus actually died? So you see what I mean? Here we have foolproof, airtight testimony of 3 independent witnesses. If you heard this story that this Jesus character, who was a Nazarene, had been raised to life, then you could go and see the 2 Marys or Salome and check it out. Having all 3 helps to support the case. Next slide. Now we can say, like Clancy, this is clever writing from a smart author or authors, just telling a story or a fable. Now, is that possible? Sure. But if this was the case and Mark wanted a bestseller or to bolster his story, then why write it this way? Mark has relied on telling this particular story on the testimony of 3 women. Now, before you start throwing things at me, I just got to put one word in here, context. At this time of writing, and in this culture, the testimony of women was not considered admissible. It didn't carry any weight. But what we see here, the reality of the situation that we have here, was that all the guys had bolted. Only the women remained faithful. And in fact, what it tells us is that Mark is actually telling us the truth here. It might have been better for him to say that a leading Pharisee or a well-reputed man came to the tomb, saw it empty, and spoke to the angelic being, and that he went out boldly proclaiming these facts to the people of Jerusalem. That would have been more credible in the context of the time. But no, what Mark says is that 3 women, Mary, and Salome, and they fled trembling and with bewilderment. It does sort of fit the way that Jesus lived, wouldn't you agree? Jesus favours the marginalised over the favoured, and those seen to us by having more credibility. The last will be first, and the first will be last in Jesus' kingdom. And in the end, it's scared, marginalised women who are given carriage of this absolutely amazing news. So countercultural. Next slide. Some may suggest that this was written much later, at a much later date. You may have heard the argument that some old Catholic monks gathered together in the 1300s and wrote these stories we have today. What is really interesting is Mark gives us another detail in the story that we might miss and just read over. In the second part of verse 1, it says, the women bought spices so they might go to anoint Jesus' body. Very early on the first day of the week, just after sunrise, they were on their way to the tomb and they asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance of the tomb? So were they expecting to see an occupied or an empty tomb? Jesus had shared with them numerous times during their life together. On the third day, I'll rise. The Son of Man will rise on the third day, just like Jonah. 3 days in the tomb, I will rise. And even in Mark, he records in Mark 14:27-28, you will fall, Jesus told them, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered. But after I have risen, I will go ahead of you into Galilee. It's interesting that nobody who was with him thought, hey, it's day 3. Remember what he said? Should we go and check it out? You never know. He might have mentioned it for a reason. What have we got to lose? There was none of that. They all saw him die and absolutely did not think he was going to rise again. Even this gospel, being written by Mark a couple of years after the event, has been careful to record the history. They all had no idea or reason to believe that Jesus would rise from the dead. So just in these couple of examples, we see Mark, which is the shortest account of all 4 Gospels, takes the utmost to record what happened historically. And can I suggest to you that if you read this fairly, come to the text on its own merits, we cannot read this as fiction. Okay, next slide. Now, if this is the case, this presents us with a bit of a problem. If this is actually what happened, what do we do with this? Verse 6 says, don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is risen. He is not here. So when Jesus rose, what actually happened? Where did he go? Did he rise as a spirit being, and then scoot off to heaven? You remember we discussed this in my talk on heaven and earth. In verse 7 it says, but go, tell the disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you. Jesus didn't go to heaven immediately. It wasn't a spiritual escape. What was the message the women had to share with the disciples? Whatever was dying or decayed or broken had been restored, renewed, and is going to see you in Galilee. Whatever was dead is now alive. Do you see how this gives us such great hope? If there is bodily resurrection, if the world can now support an event like this, then there is now the possibility of life. Because Jesus rose from the dead, we now have an opportunity to be new humans. As I've suggested before, the real hope for renewed Jesus followers is that what we see in Jesus' resurrected state will become ours one day. The reality is, though, we live in this now but not yet state. So what does the resurrection life look like today? How I see this, and I can't help but think about the recent baptisms that we had just a couple of weeks ago. We heard from all 3 candidates how they wrestled with life, its meaninglessness, looking for antidotes to fill the void. In all 3 cases, it was and is alcohol. But the Christian hope is that because of the resurrection of Jesus, we can hope for a supernatural renewal of who we are and what we now depend on to fill that void. The resurrection means that while we wrestle with life still, we know in our spirit that we have the capacity to overcome it. We have the hope to say, I can face this trial with confidence. Why? Because Jesus rose from the dead. And that means this world is not like I used to think it was. It's not the same world that it was before Jesus rose. It's much bigger than just me and my thing. It means that death is not the end and that death has now been defeated. And I can boldly proclaim this victory for my own life. Next slide. One beautiful illustration for what I'm trying to say comes from The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe by C.S. Lewis. Has anyone read that, seen that? Yeah, plenty of people. At a pivotal point, if you'll remember in the story, it tells us about one of the children, Edmund, who is seduced by the Queen with Turkish delight. And then eventually, what happens is the queen, or the witch, accuses him of betrayal. And he does that before Aslan the lion. And for being a traitor, she says to Aslan the lion, as the old law, or the deep magic as they call it, indicates that every traitor belongs to her. And unless she has blood, as the law says, all of Narnia will be overturned and will perish in fire and water. Aslan replies to this and says it's true. He could not deny it. But Aslan goes into the tent to discuss the situation with the witch. Aslan cannot go against the deep magic, but does resolve the situation. Fascinatingly, as the story goes on, it's Susan and Lucy who go with Aslan up to the hill, to the table. And it's there that the hags and the monsters and the apes take the willing Aslan, tie his paws, shave him and beat him and abuse him. And then the witch arrives to take the life of Aslan, the king of the beasts. Aslan dies for the treacherous life of Edmund. But then after a time, Aslan comes back to life and helps the children and the animal kingdom battle against the witch and her enemies. And after the battle, we find ourselves in the witch's courtyard, a stony graveyard of all those the witch has captured. And then Aslan breathes on them and they come back to life. Next slide. Lewis pens this short poem in his book. He says, "The spite of the spell of the wand of the witch has laid us in a trance which is cold and deep. But the warmth of the breath of the lungs of the lion shall waken us all from our stony sleep." And there is great celebration for all of those who receive the breath of Aslan. You get it? The animals who have the breath of Aslan and fix their eyes on him celebrate the new life. They are filled with joy and they sing how great Aslan is. If you believe that the resurrection is true, there is hope in this world. And why is that? Because Jesus, who was a man, is risen and he lives today. Next slide. If we go on and continue to read our little passage here, Mark goes on in verse 7 and says, "Go and tell the disciples and Peter." Now, Peter, why is Peter singled out here? We remember Peter's fall, an insider who fell so badly. This is not just a message for faceless humanity. This is a message for Peter, and it is also a message for you. Imagine your name on this list. Go and tell the disciples and Murray or John or Jack. Insert your name here. This is a message of mercy, a message about life out of death. This is about a transformed life now and forever. And the question remains, do you believe it? If you do already believe it, then today is such a celebration of love, mercy and truth of this message for us today. We should celebrate that Jesus has overcome death, defeated evil, and we now have been transformed into new humans for today and forever. If, however, you've never really thought about the resurrection of Jesus actually being true, you've always thought it was a nice story, an ancient ritual or something that we do at Easter, then I would ask you to consider, what does it mean a human 2,000 years ago rose from the dead? From what we have seen today, it is historically reasonable to believe that it is true. Would you be open to this possibility? Would you be willing to step into such a world? Would you be willing to discuss what it looks like living under the resurrection of Jesus from someone who is already a follower of Jesus? And would you be willing to consider it for your life today? I can assure you, the hope of a transformed life, the new view of this world and the reclaiming of life out of hopelessness and helplessness is absolutely possible. Come and join us.